Welcome to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. It is day 4,387 of us being in business, and we are so honored to be hosting Michael Lowenthal for the second time, this time virtually, for his story collection, Sex with Strangers. We are honored to have him in conversation with Stephen McCauley, and I can rarely say this about an author and his conversation partner, that I believe I have read all of both their books that they have published under their own names. There is a caveat there. We would like to say that of the new book, Christopher Castellani says, in this pitch perfect collection of sly, shapely stories, Michael Lowenthal turns his discerning eye on relationships up and down the Kinsey scale. What a tremendous gift to read such wise insights into the various ways people seduce, betray, surprise, and ultimately transform each other. In addition to the story collection, Michael Lowenthal is the author of the novels The Same Embrace, Charity Girl, and The Paternity Test, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. His writing has appeared in Plowshares, The Washington Post, and The Boston Globe. It has been anthologized widely. Stephen McCauley is the author of 7 novels under his name, including The Object of My Affection, and most recently, My Ex-Life. And he was named a Chevalier in the Order of the Arts and Letters by the French Ministry of Culture, which is just amazing on my part. I would like to introduce both of them. Let's give them a big virtual hand. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you for including me in this event. As you know, I'm a huge fan of this book, and it has the virtue of having a lot of stuff that I really want to talk about and ask you about. But I think we're going to begin by having you read from it. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm happy to read some, and thanks to you for doing this. Like Daniel, I have read all of your work under your own name,
Yeah,
which
means
we need to talk about what he was leading with there. But I knew that one of the bonuses of persuading you to do an event with me, I'm always nervous about whether there's going to be a crowd or not, and I knew that if I invited you, there would be at least one audience member guaranteed, because my mother is such a Stephen McCauley fangirl that I was, she was guaranteed to show up.
Did she? Is she here?
I can't see the list of participants,
okay.
but maybe she'll identify herself in the chat. And if she isn't here, maybe Chris Castellani will pretend that he is. And many thanks to Daniel also. I love your store. And to be there in person last time was great. My first and so far only, sadly, trip to sunny Milwaukee, but I hope to go back there soon and appreciate the virtual host. I'm going to read just the first few pages of a story called Thieves. And I don't think I need to say anything about it, so I'll just do that and then we'll reconvene on the other side. So this is Thieves. There were 2 of them, psting at me from the murk beneath a palm tree, along the jungly trail that twisted off to the shanty town. In grubby board shorts, shirtless, the slim one sat with a towel around his shoulders. The burly one stood behind, brandishing cordless clippers, and buzzed his friend's blackish hair with tender brutality. Even from 30 feet away, out on the white sand lane, I could sense the fresh crew cut's effect. His head looked newborn, true, a blank slate. Oi, he beckoned. Oi, brother. He used the English word, but Brazilianized, brother. I glimpsed his waving arm, its skinny animation, but not his face, not in any detail. The sky was starting to blur with dusk, and of the scarce street lamps along this shortcut between the Combi stop and our Surfside guest house, only one gave out any light. I'd watched boys all over the island using such lamps as targets, pelting them with beer bottles and rotting coconuts. When the bulbs burst, the hooligans cheered, "Goal!" But this kid and his roughneck pal were older, 18, 19. "Brother," the slim one called again, his voice sharp with nerve. Then he added in Portuguese, "Please, we just want to use your cell phone." This was my 3rd trip to Bahia after projects in São Tomé and Mozambique, and I could handle basic conversations in the language. Sorry, I said, don't have one. I didn't break my stride. Liar, yelled the tough with the clippers, squaring his brawny shoulders. How stupid do you think we are? Liar. A stunted mutt, scared by the shout, bolted from the bushes, but just as soon forgot its fear and fervently stole some fish bones from an overflowing wire cage of trash. Sure, I have a phone, I said, not with me. Seriously, said the lean kid, goadingly rubbing his crew cut. I thought a gringo always has his iPhone. Another 200 yards and I'd be safe at the folksy guest house with its hammock, its icy caipirinhas. I'd suffered a sticky, mosquito-addled day in a boondocks village, dickering with farmers about a loan for their Hearts of Palm plantation. No matter that the interest rate was already close to nil and that my services and the environmental advisors were pro bono, the farmers wouldn't let up on their haggling. Forget it then, I wanted to say, stick with your current pittance. Instead, I grinned my do-gooder grin and told them, yes, I understood. Yes, of course, I'd see what I could do. But now this cheeky crew-cut punk, his brazen heckle, gringo, had severed the last thread of my politeness. Carry my phone here, I said, where I might meet a thief? Thief was one of the first words my Portuguese coach had taught me, a satisfying nasal sneer, ladrão. He stood up slowly, smiling, shaking out his towel. Theatrically, he snapped it, and the world at once was weaponized. Towel, clippers, fists. Wagner, the guest house owner, had warned me about the shanty town. Crack was all he'd said, all he'd had to. Why are you alone? Said the kid, sauntering halfway toward me. He swept clipped hairs from the hollow of his scrawny, meatless chest. Just this easily, he seemed to say, I could dispense with you. I looked ahead, behind, no one on the lane. The only building, a shuttered vacation home from the island's boom days, sat dark behind its wall of concrete studded with jagged glass. Why, he repeated, where is your sexy wife? You don't know me, I said, ready to sprint. Leave me alone. No, your wife, he said, and staged a vulgar pantomime, swinging his hips, hefting imagined tits. Where is she today? Where's Marisa? I stopped short. Were they stalking her? How do you know her name? I said. I took a hard step closer. Tell me, how? He didn't flinch. He laughed. Now you defend her? Good, he said. Not like yesterday, arguing with her. Stop, Marisa, Marisa, please. He sang the words in lilting, malformed English. The gossipy little tune sapped some of his menace. What had Marisa and I been sparring about the day before? She'd been overpraising my tact with the local land agent, and I'd been trying to tamp down her sweet talk. She's not my wife, I said, guessing he meant no harm. She's just my, what was the word for coworker? Come on, what was it? My friend. Oh, a friend. Nice, he said. Friends can be more fun. He grabbed his crotch and, giving a low grunt, stirred it. Now I was laughing at the pureness of his swagger and at his conviction that I, at 38, balding, plain-faced, was sleeping with a looker like Marisa, or with any woman, for that matter. I found his cocksure act impairingly seductive. Today she didn't come, I offered. Sick, you know, her stomach. Aye, the gringos always sick. They want so much to taste our island life, but the gut says no. And you, he said, your stomach is hard and strong? Me? Oh yes, I patted my paunch. The stomach of a baiano. He nodded warmly, clearly amused I'd called myself a local. He didn't need to know about the prophylactic Cipro I'd been taking twice a day since I arrived, the script written by Craig, my internist husband. The burly kid approached now, too, revealing his darker face, his broody brow. He paused to squint judgmentally. Would he call me a liar again? Then sprang forward, bellowing something. I stiffened, stumbled back. On he barreled with bullish, galumphing charm, his cheeks dimpling. Come, he was saying, forget the cell phone, have some coconut. The water is good for you, makes you healthy. Even now that I got his words, I felt a little shaky. No, I told him I had to go. They'd miss me at the guest house. I should see if Marisa had improved. Later, he said dismissively, you must live. He opened his arms invitingly like someone in a travel ad. The lane was still deserted. Even the dog had fled. My sped up breaths infused me with a tingle of remoteness. I stood there in the dimming light, letting the island's evening soundtrack throb against my skin. Hymning frogs, the sly swish of monkeys in the mango trees. From down the lane, the sea's endless applause. Maybe the gringo is just too something, the kid with the crew cut said, using a word I didn't recognize. Yes, I think, said the bigger one, too something, to be with boys from the street like us. No, I said, come on, how can you say that? Well, he said, then so? The day's heat had dissolved into a briny, pricking breeze. The air itself seemed to egg me on. I guess I said, I guess, okay, and started down the path. So that's how he gets into all sorts of trouble in that story. And I will invite dear Stephen McCauley to come back. There you are.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
It occurs to me listening to that you kind of read the way you write, which is to say with tremendous clarity and precision and sort of perfect diction. And so that's really one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading this. As you know, because I told you this, when I read that story when it first came out, and I liked it then and I really liked it now in reading it in this collection, although I found that like reading these stories as a collection gave a little different feeling for each one. In some ways, I think I'd read this one and I read Overboy and maybe another one, I'm not sure, but it was interesting to see the way they play off each other. And I wonder if you could talk about how you assembled these stories and then arranged them.
Yeah, I mean, some of these, about half the stories are, among the more recent things I've written, and half go back a little bit to like when I was in between novels and taking a break writing stories. And when I was writing the new ones, I thought, you know what, I think maybe there's a collection here. I see themes that are similar. And so that's when I went back and took a look at it. And it was fun to try to put them together. I was, at first I was worried in a sense that they were too disparate, although I actually happen to like story collections that are all take parts from all over the place. I mean, I also can very much like ones that are linked or that all have the same narrator, or that are all in the same place. But I like ones, I mean, this is a little self-serving for me to say at this point, but I like ones that make a case for their coherence that's different, that's thematic. So I was looking at, about half of these have mostly gay characters, half have mostly straight characters. They take place in different locations, different time periods. I mean, I'd be curious to hear how, for you, that the stories sort of change when you see them together. For me, some of them seem, I worried that there was a cumulative darkness that was getting a little darker than I wanted, maybe, which is why there's one in the middle called Stud. That's a pretty, sort of 90% happy story that actually, sort of like a positive sexual experience.
I mean, it's about a miserably insecure guy who is awakened to his potential by a rogue musician, I guess you could say. That.
I guess I would also say that it was important to me as I was arranging it that the last story also has a lot of darkness in it. It involves somebody, a mentor dying of AIDS, and involves a long distance relationship that's breaking up and that probably will break up. And yet I'm hoping that the very end of it points to a kind of move towards self-knowledge that then could lead to happier relationships in the future. And so that was part of what I wanted to do, is like make this trajectory that at least points in that direction, because it starts off a little bit I don't know if bleak is the right word, but a little bit bleaker in terms of a character like desperately wanting self-knowledge and grasping after it, and then to the extent that he gets it, it's not the knowledge he wanted. I mean, here he sort of realizes that he's
Right.
stuck back where he worried he was.
I mean, I think the last story in the collection actually, I mean, it's a very sad story in many ways, but it does have a positive outcome as I interpreted it for the protagonist. So it did create kind of a nice ending to the story. But I mean, one of the things that I felt in reading the stories together, like for instance, the story that you read from Thieves, it seems to me it has this, it's the most suspenseful story, I thought, in the collection. And the reason and the tensest was because it has this combination of a threat of danger or violence even, combined with erotic anticipation, combined with anxiety about ethical behavior. And then you begin noticing that in other stories as well. And that seems to me it's a theme that runs through this collection. Do you agree with that?
Well, I thought this was a short story collection, although you've now just described it to me as my autobiography. So, it's...
You can't hide.
Yeah. No, that very much is how I am at least starting to realize a lot of those things work. And in terms of like the ethical dilemmas, actually, I think it was maybe the wonderful Chris Castellani who did identify himself in the chat, who helped me see the extent to which so many of the stories are about characters who want to have a story about themselves, a narrative about their own lives. For example, like the one in the story I just read, who he thinks of himself as a do-gooder going to a sort of a struggling, impoverished place and trying to help them out. But there's this barely concealed aggression, even in this section I read where he's like, come on, farmers, this is bullshit. And he wants to tell them off, but then he like catches himself and he puts on his do-gooder drag, but then later in the story that sort of sneaks out. And so I do think there's a lot of challenging of the sort of the ethics. I was thinking when you're talking about the reasons why this story is, I hope, suspenseful, the sort of physical danger, but then also the sexual tension. And I'm realizing how quickly I eventually dispense with the sex in this story. It takes, it's dangled and dangled and dangled, and then I think it takes like literally.
Quite literally, actually. As I remember,
yes, indeed. And then it takes about all of 10 seconds or 15 seconds to be done with. And I guess that's, part of my whole thought about writing about sex too, is that it's almost never the main dish, right? It's
well, I don't know, that's interesting because I'm very struck by the fact that sometimes people talk about writing explicitly or graphically about sex and writing honestly about sex as if that's synonymous. And I think it's often quite the opposite, I think, I don't know, like something like, 50 Shades of Grey or something, which I've read 40 pages of. Honestly, that's all. It seems to me so utterly dishonest about sex while at the same time being graphic. And I think that there's very little graphic sex in this collection of stories, despite the title. But it's very honest about the way people are motivated by sex and the role that sexuality plays in most of our lives, whether we want to admit it or not.
No, I agree. And sex that, I think it's the hardest thing to do with sex is to write an actual sexy sex scene that is honest, because I don't think I'm revealing too much about my own life here, but if somebody isn't laughing or crying or getting angry or something in a sex scene, it's like hard to believe it's an honest sex scene,
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I agree. And I'm just thinking about your books too, where like you rarely write what I would call like a graphic sex scene, but there's tremendously honest stuff about the ways people use sex and the power of sex and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, anyway, let's turn to your book. Talk about something cheerful, actually.
No, you
These graphic
don't know
stories.
you don't know how odd it is to sit here with you and have you actually clearly having read my stories and having things to say about them. Anyway, you know how much I admire your work.
Well, thank you very much. When I saw the conversation that you had with Chris Castellani, at one point, Chris asked you a question about something. He quoted you back to yourself. And, I love Chris, but I thought, oh, that's so unfair. What a rotten thing to do. And then, I went online and got like all of these things that I want to quote back to you. Because when you were talking about, I think it was your previous novel, you said, well, guilt is one of the primary driving factors in all of my writing, as it is in my life. So it's no surprise that this runs through this novel. But I wonder if you could talk about that as a kind of, I know you've touched on this already, but just the sense of guilt and how that influenced the writing of these or the themes of these stories.
I don't know. I'm not sure I have anything particularly like revelatory to say about it, other than that I seem to be drawn to writing about people who are always torn between their senses of obligation, sort of their obligation to their own self-fulfillment, their own drives, often sexual drives or drives to connect with other people, whatever, that drive seems to come into conflict with their sense of obligation to either a set of ethics or morality, or a family or a religious tradition, or a community that they've sort of build their life meaning out of. Like in one of my novels is about a summer camp, and the guy's totally has a sense of obligation to the camp that comes into conflict with his own desires. And so I find that always interesting fuel for sort of the choices that characters have to make. I'm not sure it is always a zero-sum game, but to the extent that they think it is, if they do X, are they going to be betraying Y? So then it can be within characters too. I'm always interested in characters who, this is going back a little bit to what I said about the one in Thieves, but who think of themselves or want to think of themselves as good, decent, upstanding people, and then they have desires that challenge that notion. And to me, so again, I'm thinking of that, of Avoidance, which is about a summer camp counselor who genuinely loves and is completely devoted to kids, boys, and helping them and being a mentor, and yet also finds himself attracted to one of them, which undercuts the whole thing. But I find those stories in summer camps and priests and teachers, whatever, fascinating to the extent that we can be honest about them. And the truly evil child molesters and abusers and all those people sort of don't interest me that much, right? Because it's black and white. But when we can talk about people who have genuinely good, helpful impulses, and then impulses that work against that, and how they wrestle with that, to me, that's where all the juice is,
Yeah, well, one of the creepier stories in this collection is called Uncle Kent, and it's about this. It's told from the point of view of this woman who has been involved with this man who has sort of, would you say like borderline interest in very young and sort of unhealthily thin women, and then she sort of sets up a situation where he's very close to her daughter, and that's where the Uncle Kent comes in, even though he's not really an uncle. And she realizes that there's this kind of flirting going on between this guy and the daughter. And it ends with complete, as I read it, lack of, resolution to this. Is that what you were thinking? I mean, about in that? Because I didn't know, is this guy actually predatory, or can she trust him,
Yeah, I mean, to me, that is the central question, and I was resisting coming up with a firm answer to it. I mean, that issue, probably wouldn't surprise you, is what I wrestled with the most in writing and revising, and it's the thing I was tinkering with that was sort of the last thing I was working on in this collection, and I don't know if I sort of nailed it or not, but I did want it to, I wanted her to sort of, I mean, again, she's somebody who sort of told a story of herself. She thinks she's created this sort of alternative family that is unusual but works great, because she broke up with Kent years ago because it was too toxic, but now that they're not a couple anymore, she can see the good in him, and he's wonderful with the daughter, and so she thinks, this is great. I'm a single mom, I've got my girl, and Uncle Kent is a great uncle, and just sort of like willfully ignoring the obvious looming train wreck coming, that this guy is interested in young, skinny girls and that certain kind of energy. And so I think where I got to at the end was, and this is with the help of my great friend Hester Kaplan, who was a smart reader on this story, she was, earlier drafts were a little bit more leading the reader to think, wow, he really, unless she takes action, he really might be predatory, he might be dangerous. So she's going to have to, put her foot down and maybe break up this family in a way and not let him be near the kid. But I actually think, I mean, in my own view, if I can interpret my own story, whatever, I think he's safer than that. I don't think he would ever, or I don't think it's a very quite as interesting a question to focus on him, whether he would or wouldn't cross the line. I think the more interesting question is her, and this idea that she has been willfully pushing away this knowledge that she should have seen coming. And so when that moment of reckoning finally comes, and she has to think not only about Kent and will he be a predator or not, which I imagine she can probably answer fairly confidently that he won't, but she has to really examine herself, like, why was I pushing this away? Why did I let my daughter get into this situation? Yeah, go ahead.
But isn't that what everybody says about, like Uncle Bob and Grandpa? He would never, I know he's a little weird, but he would never touch me. I mean, this is another quote from you, actually. You said, I fancy myself a clear-thinking, logical person who makes reasoned decisions, and yet, when sexual desire comes into play, so often all of that gets short-circuited. Sexuality makes people make choices that are crazy, really. And, like, we don't need to look any further than page 1 of any newspaper on any given day in the year to, I mean, it's so striking to me because it just seems like that's always what brings people down. And I don't know if that's, I mean, like, it should be all the other stuff in their lives, like it should be the racism and the, whatever all else that part of their lives, but it's often these really foolish decisions around sex that kind of.
No, and people seem to sort of quite literally not be able to help themselves and not be able to stop themselves.
There's also this story in the collection about a Catholic priest on a cruise ship, which seems to me like it never occurred to me before that there would be a priest on a cruise ship. And then, I mean, I guess there was everything else on the cruise ship. But he's another person who's kind of tormented by what seems initially to be comfort with his celibacy and And then he meets this woman that he had been involved with, and it stirs up all this sort of other longings in him. And but even when he's asked about the celibacy, he says, "Oh, everybody always asks about the celibacy, and it's not that big of a deal." Could you talk about writing this story and where that came from?
Yeah, I mean, well, first I'll say the origin. I also had never given any thought to there being priests on cruise ships, but I was years ago reading the famous David Foster Wallace, a piece about going on a cruise ship, a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again, which I love. And there's a scene in that where he goes to mass on the ship, and my head sort of spun around, and okay, there's mass on a cruise ship, so there must be priests on a cruise ship. Who are they? How long do they serve? What's that like when the whole point of a cruise is sort of like hedonistic pursuit of overindulgent pleasure? And what would it be like to be probably like the one dude there who is doing something completely different, and who's taken various vows, pushing in the other direction. And I mean, maybe part of that, the part that you're quoting, was my own trying to push back against, well, if I'm writing about a priest, do I have to write about celibacy? I mean, that's like the sort of the top line thing. But then I thought, well, of course I do, especially if he's a newly ordained priest, because I sort of pictured him in the sort of cloistered, to use a word, world of the seminary. And of course they talk about it and deal with it. And I had long conversations with a friend of mine who had been through seminary, about all this, and about how it's talked about, and about the discussions, and how he and some of his friends wrestled with that question. But anyway, I pictured the priest as sort of going through that almost more intellectual, theoretical idea about what celibacy would mean, and then getting thrown out into sort of the quote unquote real world for the first time, and having those ideas tested. And in some ways, I mean, so of course it gets tested by his encounter with this ex-girlfriend, but in another way, I almost think it's more tested by the woman who we see him sort of counseling in confession, who's a very middle of the road Iowa, housewife, basically, who has fallen in love with a woman online, and they haven't barely even really had an affair. But it's making her rethink everything about her life. She's middle-aged, she has kids who are already in college. And I think, I hope that is sort of the mechanism for the priest to think about sort of the choices you make, the life path you go on, the things you tell yourself you're going to be able to settle for and indeed embrace affirmatively, and then how there might be these moments when that gets thrown completely out of whack, and he sort of has to test everything he's thought about and learned against that kind of a possibility.
I really wanted a different kind of outcome for that woman. I was very sympathetic to her plight, and I think that's a real testament to the story, and how, how plausible, how believable her problem is, and how sympathetic she is in many ways as a character. So, there are some interesting questions coming in over the chat that I want to ask, but I do want to just make sure that we have time for this. The last story in the collection seems to me kind of herds a lot of cats thematically in the story, in the collection, in a way, and I thought it was a great way to end the collection. And it's about a young guy who is helping with the health care of his mentor, who's dying of AIDS in Maine. And I'm assuming that this is based on John Preston, who was an editor and writer. And I know that he was a mentor for you. And I wonder if you could maybe just talk a little bit about John Preston and writing about him. And
Sure, yeah. Yeah, John, for those who don't know, he was a writer and an editor who had, and a gay rights activist and a AIDS and safe sex activist who had a long career, including editing The Advocate in the 70s or 80s. And then it started in the early 90s, editing these sort of landmark series of anthologies on various topics, sort of gay men writing about various topics. And they were published by big, mainstream New York publisher. And so they were pretty, I think, important cultural thing. And I initially just submitted an essay to one of those, and John got in touch and published it, and we started this friendship. And he was so great. But by the time we became a little bit better friends, he explicitly said, he called one day and explicitly said, I want to be your mentor, and I've picked 3 writers, and you're one of them, and I want to be officially your mentor. And you're officially my proteges, and you can call me anytime, write me anytime, ask me for any kind of help, and I'll always introduce you around and all that kind of stuff. So it was sort of amazing. And particularly because, I didn't go to an MFA program or grad school for writing. And I often think the biggest thing and people like me who didn't do that miss out on is those sort of instant connections where you can ask people for letters of recommendation and introductions to their agents and all that kind of stuff. In any case, we became very close, and when he got sicker, I became part of the small group of people who helped take care of him. So I would drive over to Maine once a week from New Hampshire and help take care of him. And then when he died, I took over, at his request, I took over sort of three or four of his remaining book projects, which was, sort of gave me a big hand up into my own career, to be honest, when I was about 25 years old. So this story, it is very much based in that situation, and I stole all the details and the feeling of being in John's apartment in Maine. And there's the mother character in the story I took pretty directly from my memories of John's mother, who is this incredible sort of 80-something Republican woman from Medfield, Mass, who'd been like on the town clerk or the city council or something, and this very, very proper, upright, woman. But she was right there with John when he was sick, and she was completely unfazed by, John had been a pornographer and a hustler, and she was not fazed by any of that. Anyway, so I took that whole the feel of that and the setting and the situation, and then built a fictional story out of it, to try to herd all those thematic cats and to sort of pass the baton in a way, the same way that John had done for me. And so it's funny, not to drop names, I'm almost done with this, not to drop names, but Andrew Holleran, another writer I revere and admire, sent me a note about that story. And he said he was also friends with John. And he said, at first I thought, wait, you can't do this. You can't take a character's death, especially from AIDS, and just use it for a gay relationship story. And then he was like, well, actually, I see what you're doing, that it's about the mentor sort of giving this final gift of advice about how to go forward in life. So that's, again, so part of why I wanted it as the last story to point towards this vision of how to try to pull together a more self-aware, forward-looking life.
Well, and I think you make a very convincing case that the character based on John Preston would have wanted things to turn out this way for the I can't remember if is he the narrator of the story or just the main character. I can't. Is that a first person
narrator
story?
Yeah, narrator.
A first person story. I recently read The Secret Historian about Sam Stewart and John Preston, who published erotic novels under the name of Phil Andros, and
I love that book.
It's amazing.
It's incredible.
It's a really incredible book. But John Preston was a good pal of his, I guess, at the end,
Yeah,
and he was influential. He had an influence on John Preston's career and life and so on. So
yeah, John actually got Sam Stewart, who wrote his Philandros, was also he was a professor at maybe Loyola or somewhere in Chicago, DePaul in Chicago. But he was also a tattoo artist who was in sort of the gay underground and tattooing sailors in the 40s and 50s. So he tattooed John, I think a pink triangle inkwell sort of, and John, I mean, this is a little bit, highfalutin, but when John did his whole thing about, I'm going to be your mentor, he talked about how Samuel Stewart had been his mentor, and actually Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas had been Sam Stewart's mentor, influential to him. So John was very sort of self-conscious about, we're going to create this lineage of sort of chosen gay mentor family. So anyway, but yeah, I don't know if Daniel, if you want to put that in the chat or anything, but that The Secret Historian by Justin Spring, such a great book that I hope everybody will have a chance to read.
Yeah, I think we should get to some of these questions in the chat, and this is in no particular order, but John Barrett asks you the question. My experience with the characters in Overboy, which is the first story in the collection, changed significantly from my first read years ago to my most recent. Did you have a similar experience as author when you revisited these characters, especially Keith and Stan?
Yeah, I mean, so in that story, the main character it's his 29th birthday, and he thinks he's terribly over the hill. And then he encounters a guy named Stan, who I think I have him in his 40s or something like that.
Oh.
And
oh God.
And when I wrote it, I was much closer to 29. And I think I was sort of looking toward realizing that if I didn't get my act together about the fact that I would someday be in my 40s and even beyond, I might end up being a pretty unhappy camper, if I remained obsessed with youth or whatever. But the character, perhaps myself, I don't know, the character knows he needs to get there and wants to get there, and he sort of can't make himself get there. And now when I look at it, yeah, I mean, I want to sort of slap the 29-year-old character, and but I did a bunch of revision in a lot of these stories, both to make them fit as a collection and to eliminate some inconsistencies and whatnot, and just to sort of update them. But actually, Overboy, I sort of resisted the temptation to change it too much from my own older and possibly wiser point of view. I sort of wanted to let it be its own artifact and let different readers at different ages come to it differently, so that John could have, for example, his experience. John's just about exactly my age, although he looks, 30 years younger. But John could have that experience, and I myself had that experience. That I definitely identify. I mean, I still identify with both of them, I guess I would say now. In the first round, I didn't identify with Stan really, and now I do. But I also still identify with the younger one, who's sort of terrified of what it's going to mean to go through that process and how that's going to change his attractiveness and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, it's like, it doesn't really matter, because when you're on the kind of threshold of any stage of life, then, you feel like you've got to make a transition into it, even though from the point of view of a 65-year-old person, like the idea of being worried that you're 29 years old, you're over the hill, seems ridiculous. I mean, it is a meaningful change, especially maybe, I don't know, for gay men who are, identify in certain ways as, putting their youth or looks that inevitably must change forward. So I don't know. Anyway, Eleanor Lipman, hi Ellie, asked for the title of the Phil Andros book. After I read The Secret Historian, I looked for some of these Phil Andros novels, and they are literally selling for like $900. So clearly we're in the wrong business here. folks. So I'm not sure what the title of it. The titles of a lot of those books are sort of what you would imagine, like, I don't know, Stud, I think, is one title, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway. Okay. Jay Philomena says, hate to ask this because your mother is on the call. However, can you explain why you feel guilt is a relevant part of your life and why you feel it affects your work so?
Actually, maybe I'll go into it this way, and I don't think it's just because my mother is on the call, but I wonder if most of my guilt is sort of vestigial, if that makes sense, and how that the much overused Flannery O'Connor quote about anybody who survives their childhood has more than enough material or has understanding of human nature or something. And I think, like many writers, a lot of the fuel for my writing comes from whether or not I'm writing about childhood or young life or coming of age. It comes from sort of the imprinting experience, the imprinting relationship to the world that formed me at that time. And I do think there was guilt then, and sexual guilt about probably being attracted to boys and not knowing how that fit in, and would I disappoint my family and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I hope I don't delude myself into thinking that I'm actually a few decades beyond actually feeling that intensely in my like real life, my day-to-day life, but in my fantasy life, my imaginative life, when I think about how people get into sticky situations and how they negotiate competing obligations and competing senses of decency and ethics, that is the place I go back to. But I oddly enough feel relatively guilt-free now. I hope that doesn't destroy my writing going forward.
May destroy your life. That's well, I mean, we're out of time, I think, but it is true that in that same quote where you mentioned guilt as kind of a factor in your life and in your fiction as well, you did talk about consequences for actions, and particularly for sexuality. And it seems to me that we always talk about guilt as if it's a bad thing, but sometimes it can be like a necessary kind of I don't know, just awareness of consequences for behavior. Because so anyway.
I will say I was able to click in the chat myself, and I saw somebody ask if I've read anything good lately, and there are so many books that I'm desperate to recommend, but I'm going to do it this way because I haven't had the chance to mention any in previous readings, and I just want to say I have three. Steve, you probably have this experience too. I mean, there's nothing better than having a student then go on to publish a book, particularly if it's a book you like. And I am lucky enough that in the next month, 2 months, 3 months, 3 of my wonderful favorite former students are having books come out. So some of these would need pre-ordering, but I just want to mention them. I don't know if I probably am not a fast enough typist. I don't know if Dan will be able to. One is called Pleasant View by Celeste Mohammed. Fabulous linked collection of linked stories all set in Trinidad, like a fictional neighborhood in Trinidad. And it's just filled with fabulous language and class and race and politics and just good old storytelling. And then Cheney Kwok has a book called The Passenger that's about to come out in a month or two, which is his incredible account of being stuck on that cruise ship off the coast of Norway like 2 years ago that lost power in this huge storm and was like crashing over. And so he does this like 27 hours account of the tragedy, not tragedy, but of the, screw up. but then he also layers in his sort of failing marriage and also his family history of being in peril in Korea and then getting out. So it's, fabulous. And then the third one I'll mention, An Ordinary Wonder by Buki Papillon, which I think came out like last week in England, and then it's going to come out in the US later this fall. And it's about a trans character in Nigeria, and really fascinating given the culture and the politics and the situation there. So anyway, there's so many other wonderful books I could read, but since those are mostly not going to be on the tip of other people's tongues yet, although they will soon. So thank you, Daniel.
I have both of your books here. I have almost everything. I can't find one of yours. I even have one of your anthologies.
The aforementioned John Preston.
Yes, the John Preston anthology. This Hometowns one was one of my favorite books of all time. I just love this one so much. And it's really old, so how I would know I loved it is beyond me. So I should not have a memory for that. What an amazing evening. What a beautiful collection. I just want to say, to kick in, guilt is the driving force for all good I do in my life. So I'm not against it. So I just want to counterpoint that. And looking forward to whatever both of you do in the future. I will be there to add it to my pile. So thank you both. Thank you everybody for coming. We wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you, and hope to see you at another event.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye.